All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live stream. This is the rescheduled edition of the first entry in a new series from WIRSPA called the Icon Series. Really excited to have everyone back for today. I know last week we had some issues during the originally scheduled date, so I want to say thank you to everyone who's rejoining us this week for your patience. Thank you to Evan and Matt as well for being willing to come back and give it another try. I think we're all good for this week, so really excited to get started. Your host today is WIRSPA Community Envoy Matt Petrick, and joining him is a very special guest, Evon Brown, the former WIRSPA chairman and CEO of National Rums of Jamaica. I'm going to let Matt give you the more formal introduction in just a moment. Before we get started, I'm Will Hookinga from Zavvi.co. and want to point out a couple of ways, as always, that you can interact with your host and Evan throughout the show today. So to your right, there's a chat box. Feel free to say hello and let us know where in the world you're joining us from. I already see a lot of people from all over Virginia, Canada, Panama. So always great to see a global audience for these live streams. If you have a topic-related question or anything like that throughout the live stream, there's a little button at the bottom that says ask a question. So just click that button, enter your question in down there. I'll be keeping an eye on those for Matt and Evan throughout the show. And also feel free to share the event, invite your friends to join us. There's a button at the top that makes it easy to do that. But with all that said, Matt, I will turn things over to you now.
Yes, thank you, Will. It's an honor to be here. I know we tried to do this last time. It had some networking issues, but we're looking and sounding much better now. So it's my distinct honor to sort of reintroduce Evon Brown, the former WIRSPA chairman of WIRSPA and the former CEO of National Rums of Jamaica. Evon played some very important roles in the rum and Jamaican sugar industry over the decades, and he's got a lot to share with us. And what Evon's going to share is a pattern we're trying to replicate with a bunch of people who are now icons in the Caribbean rum industry. That over the past 50 years that WIRSPA has been around, there's been some amazing work that has been done to elevate Caribbean rum and to make it into the market it is now. This is a large part of that success, of today's success, is due to people like Evon and Yesu Persaud of Guyana and Patrick Mayer of Barbados, and names we don't necessarily hear much in the current context, but we're enjoying the fruits of their labors over the past few decades. So it's our goal in this Icon series to bring these to you and to share their wealth of knowledge with you over the coming months in this Icon series. But we're super glad to have Evon as the former WIRSPA chairman at a particularly pivotal moment in history to be our first icon in this series. So Evon's going to be telling us all about his career in the Jamaican rum industry, rum and sugar industry. I've got some great questions for him, and I just want before we jump into them, I want to say that much of Evon's experience was actually not just rum, but also the sugar industry. And it's something a lot of people don't realize is that the rum industry in the Caribbean was very tied to the sugar industry, and in many ways, for many years, was sort of the lesser industry in the sense of sugar, getting the most sugar and exporting the most sugar was the main goal of what companies were trying to achieve, and rum was a secondary product they made, and it was good quality, but it was sort of like their focus was on making the most sugar, and then rum was made with whatever they had remaining in fermentable materials. So in Evon's history, you'll see that he's actually played a very important role in the Jamaican sugar industry, not just the rum industry. So with that sort of preface, I'd like to jump in with Evon, and let's start by, Evon, could you give us a sort of a brief overview of sort of set the stage with the Jamaican rum industry in the decades prior to your coming in, and then sort of how you came into the Jamaican rum industry?
Thank you very much, Matt, and thanks for that very kind introduction and for your kind words. And really good to see you as well, Will. And you have set the stage perfectly, Matt, in terms of making the link between sugar and rum. So what I will briefly say is that, listen, join me as we journey through the recesses of your own mind and briefly recount the stories of the recorded history of sugar and rum as a sequel to connecting all the dots and the experiences that I have had during my unbroken 58 years service to the sugar and rum industry until my retirement. So let us start from there. Um, the last time we did speak about the genesis of sugar. We wouldn't bother to go back that far, obviously, but just to remind everyone that when the sugar was brought to the New World and to the West Indies, it was brought by the Europeans. And very soon we had with us the plantation system arising from that venture. And the plantation system, as you know, was built on slavery. When slavery was abolished by the British in 1834, and the British took control of the sugar industry in the Caribbean. They were the dominant factor. And so they abolished slavery in 1834 and 1838. We had emancipation. And then that changed the whole plantation system because the cost of producing sugar became very expensive at that point in time because we had no slave labor. And so the indentured labor had to be brought in from India and elsewhere. And that signaled to the Europeans that we've got to find some other alternative or some other way of meeting our sweetening demands. And remember, cane sugar had replaced honey as the sweetener. And it was about that time that the beet sugar, it was discovered in France that beet sugar was a possibility. And indeed, and in fact, the beet produced sugar, which was similar to the cane sugar. And so that would develop in Europe. And so we had two things going at the same time. We had the development of the beet sugar, and we had the West Indies producing the cane sugar, which was very, very important, not only to the economies of the West Indies, but also to Europe and Britain in particular, because it was the sugar, raw sugar from cane, that produced initially the wealth to the Europeans in England, and thereafter helped to sponsor the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the trade and world as we know it. So that was the beginning of a shift from the Caribbean of their sugar plantations to rum in the first instance. Because, and it's very interesting to go about rum because, as the old legend goes, molasses in those days, which is a byproduct of sugar, had no value, and it was thrown to waste in the fields or on the roadside wherever it could. And one day, a slave came by, hot and thirsty, took a ladle, dipped up some of that liquid, drank it, liquor flew to his head, and rum was born. Everybody thereafter started building distilleries to their sugar factories. That's what legend says how it started, and that it started in Barbados in around about 1650, thereabouts. But the sugar industry was very, very important to the Caribbean and West Indian region. And the British, in particular, had built up many refineries for refining the raw sugar because we sent it unrefined to Europe. Then they set aside their refinery processes and distributed through the markets throughout Europe. And so it was important to get a supply of the sugar from the Caribbean, cane sugar, but at the same time, they were also watching the beet sugar industry grow within Europe. And so you had refineries in UK doing both cane sugar and beet sugar. And this is very important because there were several refineries at that time, but there were two outstanding ones, and they were fierce competitors. And somehow, after the World War I, they got together and they formed a company in 1921. It was Henry Tate and Sons and Abraham Lyle and Sons, and they formed a company called Tate and Lyle. And they became the giant refinery in the UK, doing both refinery from beet sugar and also from cane sugar. But they had an interest, obviously, in ensuring that the cane sugar supplies were adequate, because there was great competition also among beet growers. In the war, you had destruction of the beet fields and the refineries, and so cane sugar became important. So Tate and Lyle decided that to ensure their supplies of raw cane sugar, they had to invest within the region. So they invested in Trinidad and Jamaica, Mauritius, and a few other countries. And they came to Jamaica in 1937. And that is how the modern Jamaica sugar industry started. Because when Tate and Lyle came in and they formed a company called the West Indian Sugar Company, and they set up two giant factories, one at Frome in Westmoreland, which is in the southern part of the country, southwestern part of the country, and the other one, which is in central Jamaica, which is Monimus in Vere Clarendon. So they had those two, and they became the giants of the sugar industry in Jamaica.
I just want to jump in really quick and say a little additional context here is that companies like Tate and Lyle and Booker's in Guyana were basically creating giant supply chains, like entirely horizontal supply chains, from owning from the sugar estates to the factories, to the shipping that would take the sugar back to Europe, to the refineries in Europe, to the selling in Europe. Like literally, they owned an entire supply chain, and I think that's an important part of history that most people don't understand. So.
Absolutely, thanks for that, Matt. Absolutely, and there are multinational corporations, and so you had to take seriously the things they said and did, because you know that they had all the marketing power, they had the finances to back it up, and the very growth of the industry was dependent on them. So when they came to these countries, they took charge, and and of course, as I mentioned before, there started to be a decline in the West Indies in terms of the cane sugar, not only because of cost, but primarily because of cost, especially after slavery had been abolished, but also from the competing beet sugar. And so that became very key. So the question then became one of the economics of it.
Right. And as well, we were also sort of seeing that while sugar was initially dominant on sort of the Caribbean islands, we see, for example, like the French or the Spanish in particular, but the French to a lesser extent, started expanding out into other areas like Latin America, where there's just more land. So they just had the advantage of scale there that you didn't have on some of the smaller Caribbean islands as well. That was also sort of, even though it was cane sugar, it could be made cheaper than maybe could be made on an island like Jamaica.
Indeed so. And as a matter of fact, cane sugar started in Barbados. And thereafter, it grew through the entire Caribbean. But it started going to bigger and bigger and bigger islands as there was more space and land available. And cane is very hard on the soil. And once you start to get some of the nutrients out of the soil, you have to replace it. And so you go to a brand new piece of land and you get better yields, because that has not yet been grown on. And so a lot of that happened, it was very important. It was very important. And that is how from Cuba, for instance, became the world's largest sugar producer for a long time because they had a big land mass and all the facilities were there and all the modernization had taken place. But as I reminded you last time, and a quick reminder again, when I entered the sugar industry in 1961, joined Peyton Lyle's Western Sugar Company at Monmouth, I really started on what was called a staff development course. And that was like a 2-year university course on hands experience. But I went through every single important department. So everyone. So I spent 4 months in each of those four departments. And so you had to learn faster. You had to write reports, you had to sit in the boardroom, taking exams every 3 or 4 months. You took full exams. That is really what it amounted to. And I will never forget, just before the end of my training course, the chairman of the West Indies Sugar Company delivered to his annual general meeting, 26th annual general meeting of WIRSPA in London in 1963, his report. And that made such a profound mark on me because he identified areas of concern. He identified the fact that the 1962 operations, Jamaican operations for Peyton Lyle, were unsatisfactory. From in Westmoreland, they spent a lot of money, he said, and they were making a small return. And this was a rain-fed area. But it was at Monmouth that they had grave concerns because up to that point, they had spent something like £3 million, Great Britain pounds, and they were making losses. The yield, and Monmouth, of course, is a the whole area there is a very dry, harsh area. Depended very much on irrigation for the growth of good proper cane. And so it's very expensive. So the chairman pointed out in his report that unless you can recover increased and improved yields from those fields to cushion the cost of irrigation, you are fighting a losing battle. And he mentioned that. And he mentioned, I recall, that the sugar agreement that we had with the Commonwealth is called the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement. It was very, very important for Jamaica's future because it gave a guaranteed outlet for the Jamaican sugar at prices that were reasonably good prices as long as you could continue to meet those numbers that had been set out. And he went through a whole range of things, and I read it. As a matter of fact, today, some 58 years later, I still have that clipping among my souvenirs. That statement made by the WIRSPA chairman back then, because it forewarned us of the dangers ahead.
So this is from your very early days at Monmouth. So you were in the early 1960s is when you joined the program?
Yes.
Okay. And you said
I joined it 1st of January 1962.
Okay. You joined it and were part of a training program that went through, sort of had you go through all the different positions and roles to learn the entire business as it were.
Yes, that's correct. That is correct. And at the end of the 2 years, they had assessed you for each quarterly or 4-monthly period that you spent in the various departments. And at the end, they placed you in a department where they thought they had most need and that you could adequately help to fill that need.
Okay. And where did you end up?
I found myself at the end of my course in the accounts department.
Okay. And if I remember correctly, in the 1960s, Jamaica obviously gained its independence in the 1960s. The Jamaican sugar industry was transforming quite a bit. Can you tell us more about what that after joining, what the transformation of the Jamaican sugar industry was, and what role you played in that.
Yes, well, in the 60s, I really spent most of the 60s still in the learning process. Um, I was very involved, obviously, with the company matters and the affairs, with their reactions in the community, because the community is very much a part of the way you operate. And in the case of sugar, we had what we call company towns. Anywhere you found a sugar factory, there was a town that was there, and a main town that supported that community. And so in the case of Monmouth, it was Lionel Town, but each sugar factory had their own. And so we had to make sure that, in Lionel Town, which was a company town, that, that the community was well taken care of, and anything that we could do, we would do. So we used to concentrate on things like that. But more than that, apart from, and trying to do my work, obviously, quite apart from that, we had to understand the wider issues. And that is why this chairman's statement I mentioned to you in 1963 was profound to me, because it did lay out a whole series of things and avenues that we needed to have, obviously, ensured that we had overcome. And a lot of it was forewarnings of, the difficulties ahead. And we had many commissions of inquiry thereafter. We had one major one that was called the Mills Commission of Inquiry. And that one was really, really one of the most serious and wide-scale commissions that we ever had. It investigated everything. And that one also warned us of the impending dangers, not only because we're a nation, and there was much euphoria in having attained our independence and so on, but there were warnings too that we had to do a number of things. And so some of the factories that were already, beginning to show strains and stress and not being able to meet the necessary targets that had been set for meeting our quotas and things like those, we had to be paying due attention to that. It was a time, of course, obviously, that wages were very much on the minds of workers, because coming from where they were back when 1937, and a lot of headway had been made, but there was still a far way to go, and there were still some elements of the plantation system that had been around in the Jamaican industry.
Right.
And so those are the things that were coming to play, and so ways and means had to be found to deal with it. So yes, the answer is yes. A lot of the smaller factories started to feel the pinch and started to buckle under the pressure, and which is one of the things that tantalized when they came. At Rome they found 16 estates and 7 small factories and created and so on. They built one central factory, which was the most modern within the Caribbean.
Right.
In 1939, when it came to Monmouth, they operated the mills that they found in 1937. They operated that until 1949. Some 12 years later, in 1949, they left old Monmouth and built a new factory, the site that is now, that they call New Monmouth.
Right.
And built a distillery at that time too, a modern distillery.
Right. And I think what we're seeing, what you're getting at, is there was sort of, especially in the 60s, or sort of a wave of consolidation, and also distilleries closing, like I think declared redundant, I think was the terminology. But like we saw, for example, I think Worthy Park closed in 1964. But there was this sort of, like you said, an assessment of the profitability of the sugar industry there. And you saw sort of the maybe the older, smaller factories shutting down, and like the newer ones, more efficient, sort of taking on more of the sugar industry, of the sugar cane, going to the newer, more modern factories. Is that a fair assessment?
No, indeed, so much. As a matter of fact, just going back a bit to the genesis of rum, because each sugar factory, as I said earlier, when I joked about that legend, each sugar factory built a distillery, and the distilleries were now considered a part of the sugar operation. And when times were tough in meeting your cost of production for sugar, the distillery revenues went across the sugar, And so it was seen as a part and parcel of the entire complex. Indeed, and in fact, in Jamaica, by law, you couldn't operate a distillery unless you got it from the factory. The license went to the sugar factory. And the Jamaican rum in those days was only pot still rums, as you know, we have discussed in the past.
And that was going to be my next question there.
But I'm just leaving it at that for the time being, until you ask the question.
Okay, yeah. So as you were saying, the Jamaican rum industry was undergoing changes, and there was also, but up until around the 1960s, it was entirely pot distilled, whereas the majority of the Caribbean, or almost all of the Caribbean, had started the move to continuous distillation for efficiency, for cost, and so forth. But Jamaica held on to the pot stills for the longest. And then, as we understand it, around 1960 or so, the first column came to Jamaica. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, like who it was and sort of what the thinking was that led the column to be introduced into Jamaica?
Yes, Matt. Let me start first by saying that Jamaica had built up a very fine reputation for their rums. It really was the rum, and this fine reputation was built on the pot still rums, which were very flavorful, and it was different from the rum that you find anywhere else. So it commanded premium prices on the world market, and it was well sought after. And so you found that distillers and distilleries and owners were reluctant, even when the new method came in with the column still, producing a lighter rum that with a lot of the flavors and things of that nature. There was reluctance to head in that direction into an unknown market, because the market had been established for good old Jamaican rum, flavorful rums, and it was well liked. Although, with the advent of the lighter types of rums, people were saying, well, look, let us get a little finer, a little more refined rum, and so on and so forth.
And I think that's an important point to make, is people, the enthusiasts now are all very much in favor of the very, flavorful, robust rums. But in the 50s and 60s, the rum market seemed to be running towards the very light, more refined rums. And people don't know this 50 years later. So.
Indeed so. And so Jamaica at that stage we had 20 distilleries. Back in when I joined, there were 20 sugar factories and distilleries. And but some of the distilleries now and sugar factories, of course, needed upgrading, needed to improve the techniques and so on. And but because of this reluctance, we continued until it came to a point where the pressures had really built now and something had to be done. So in 1959, the Sugar Manufacturers Association and the rum section of it said, I tell you what, let us really get a distillery and rum expert to study the Jamaican industry, do a worldwide study, tell us what is going on in the world and what we need to do so we can sit and make some decisions on the future. And that was, as a matter of fact, that review was conducted by a former WIRSPA factory manager at Pearl, and he was a Filipino, but he was excellent and he knew all about it. So he did that study and he put forward some recommendations. And in 1960, the main recommendations that were accepted that yes, we need to rationalize our capacity. We need to move towards the new technology, which is column still, and we need to make sure that there was adequate opportunities for those remaining in the industry to grow and to fit into this new world of rum that we were talking about. And so that was in 1960. As a matter of fact, the first column distillation still went to a small distillery called Bible in St. Catherine. And but Money Must got one very early too, 1961. As a matter of fact, I speak about it in nostalgia because I say when they were drafting up various things that we did as trainees, and in my case, as a trainee, one of the things I did when I was assigned to the factory department was that I was given a 3-week task to commission a demineralizing water plant and also to come up with a system to record and monitor the efficiencies of the new column still. And I look back at it and I smile because exactly years later I found myself there.
Yeah.
But yes, but it was in 1961. As a matter of fact, Money Musk had put out a rum. They did put it out. It was manufactured Money Musk, and Pride and Label, that it was a company, put it out in 1961. The rum was called Sugar Mill.
Yes, I've seen it. I've seen advertisements. I have a bunch of advertisements for it.
Yes, Sugar Mill continuous still.
Yeah. So that
Yes.
so the Sugar Mill rum was from Money Musk.
That is correct. That is correct. And that is how the column distillation came to Jamaica in the 1960s. It mushroomed thereafter. And so when you look at the production year after year, instead of having 6 million liquid gallons of pot still rum, you got to a point where it started first 4 pot and 2 column until it switched right around. And now it is the other way around. You have more column than pot.
Right, for sure. So let's jump ahead about a decade into the 1970s when you became general manager of the Money Musk Sugar Factory. Tell us about what the Money Musk Sugar Factory was doing at that point in time.
Okay, just before jumping straight to the Money Musk Sugar Factory, again, you find me coming back each time and making mention of the WIRSPA chairman's report to his board of 1963. And I say that because I need to tell you that in 1971, West Indian Sugar Company announced that they were going to be coming out of the cane cultivation and concentrating on the factory only part of the business. So they sold their cane operations, their fields, to the government. So the government took over the fields at Frome and the fields at Money Musk. And as they were at it, there was a multinational corporation, United Fruit Company, that owned Burner Lodge. And they surrendered their lands too. So the government took the lands of those 3 companies and put into a new government company called the Frome Money Musk Land Company.
Okay. So this was sort of a small bit of sort of the nationalization we saw elsewhere across.
Right. It really wasn't nationalization in the sense that they were all compensated. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. And but the arrangement was that those same factories would then lease the land to continue the operation to support their sugar factory. But they leased the land that they had sold to the government from this land company.
Right.
And the government of the day had a plan that said that okay, over time they were going to sell the lands in large plots to large farmers to continue the operation. But just about the same time there was a change of government, and the new government of Michael Manley had a different view of it, and he said, no, we need to do something better than that. We need to somehow empower the workers who were working on those lands. And so they decided that they would introduce the cooperatives. So rather than selling the land or leasing the land to big farmers, they now set up cooperatives, starting one each at Frome, one was in Burner Lodge at first.
Right.
So I just mentioned that as a background to tell you that Tate and Lyle were already on their way out.
Right.
Right. And so in the 70s, they were already out of the cane growing aspect of it, except on the lease basis, but they were operating the sugar factory. So by the time when I became general manager in 1978, they had just given up the other half of their operation in Jamaica, which was the factory. So in 71 they gave up the fields, in 77 they gave up the factory. 6 years later they gave up the factory.
Right.
But when I became general manager, we were still continuing all the operations that the West Indian Sugar Company had in fact introduced. And you know, that included cane growing and research, it included the tractors and transport, it included the factory and distillery, it included well, industrial relations and labor relations is always very key in all of that.
Right.
But in the factory operations, and this is most importantly, they had the most diversified operation in the Caribbean. We did refined sugar, icing sugar, packaged sugar, refined, and raw sugar for the market. So we had the only packaging plant in the island at the time. We had in the Caribbean. We were the only refinery in the Caribbean, and that was a big thing. We stopped the refinery in 1979. And for my sins, I did that because we had an international quota to meet. And by cutting back on naked refined sugar, we were able to fulfill our export quota.
Right. And I think it's an important part for people to realize is that in that era, it was very much all sorts of quotas and regulations and controls over what a factory or a company could produce, what they could export, what they could import into the EU. So there was lots of regulations that were constraining enterprises from just sort of maximizing what they were trying to do and trying to make as much money because they had other regulations sort of holding them back.
Yes. And as a matter of fact, when the UK joined the European Union, I step back a little bit first. They had the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement of 1951, which gave this guarantee to the African Caribbean and Pacific nations that they had investments in to provide them with raw sugar for their refineries. But when they were entering into the EU, that was a standalone agreement and it couldn't work. So that is when they had a new negotiation and they introduced what they call the Sugar Protocol.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that was really very, very important too.
Right. That was in 73 or so when
that was exactly. That was 73, 74. And so the Sugar Protocol replaced the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement. But this is where a lot of Caribbean producers sort of got a little carried away because it was of indefinite duration, and what's more, the quotas were bound in the WTO. So producers in the Caribbean took that to mean that, oh, we have guaranteed tenure. No problems, we will still continue to supply. We have a guaranteed market with guaranteed prices. And you could not get the thinking in the Caribbean to move away from that to understand that, yes, that is now, but later it could be different because even though you're told that it is of indefinite duration, it's not indefinite. Mm-hmm. Nothing is indefinite.
Right. Yeah. You would start seeing.
And we learned that lesson in rum, and I was trying to get them to understand, you know.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to I think touch on that on the rum aspect in a little bit, but if my math is correct, that from 16 years from joining Money Musk, you were essentially running everything, the Money Musk Sugar Factory. Within 16 years, you're running the factory. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. That is a fair statement because when the National Sugar Company, government formed the National Sugar Company to take over not only the two Tatum line factories and operations and Bernard Lodge, but there were 5 more. So National Sugar Company took over 8 of the 12 sugar estates.
Right. And this was in 1980 or so?
Sorry?
That this was around 1980 that the National...
This happened between 1975 to 1979.
Okay. And so again, we sort of see that a little bit of, again, maybe not nationalization, but essentially the Jamaican government coming more and more into the sugar and rum industry to help keep it afloat, because if without their intervention, the companies would say they're not profitable and just shut them down. So the government sort of trying to keep these industries viable by managing themselves. Is that an accurate statement?
No, that is quite accurate. As a matter of fact, National Sugar had to ensure that we could keep the social fabric alive, and workers. I mean, the bulk of the workers in the sugar industry and the earnings from sugar, foreign exchange earnings, were very important to the government. So they literally had no choice.
Right.
And most importantly, to keep social fabric alive.
Right.
And but that was a huge challenge, because what happened is that between 1975 and 1979, the government took over these 8 entities, all losing money. Not one was making a profit. They were all loss-making machineries by that point in time. And they were all handed to National Sugar Company. And the government said, well, you have to try and run these. You have to make sure that we keep our quotas. And we, as I said, we sustain the social fabric. And whilst we continue to see how best we can make these things viable. But there are no resources to do that. And so in the old Jamaican parlance, you'd say you've got basket to carry water. Okay? So that was the situation that we were faced with. Nonetheless, we continued, and in 1979, I was still running one of the 8 subsidiaries, because I was at Monmouth. But then they summoned me to the head office of National Rums in 1980.
Yes. So tell us about that. That was sort of the next question: is how did this segue into National Rums of Jamaica?
Well, that's not that one. That was National Sugar. Mm. So National Sugar had a head office in Kingston, running 8 sugar factories, and so they looked around and they said, Evon Brown, we need you to come to Kingston. You are the group operations manager. You are in charge of running 8 sugar factories. And that's why I can speak passionately about running it without money.
Okay.
But before that, you know, I should tell you that in my own thought process from 1979, I looked around and I said, you know, with all the restructuring taking place, and I said, we need to separate sugar and rums. This business of continuing, you know, having the rum industry inextricably tied to the sugar industry was not a good idea at this point, because if you are really going to be trying to grow the business, you have to give focused attention to the rum, right, and focused attention to the sugar. So there had to be a divide.
Right. I think what you're saying is that the future of the sugar industry and the profitability of the sugar industry may have been in doubt, but you saw potential in the rum industry if it could be unshackled from there.
Absolutely, and I was clear in my mind about that.
Okay.
And so I did float the idea in 1979. Let us form a holding company for rum, the rum assets of the National Sugar Company. Let us form a holding company so we could transfer the assets there. And so I did float that idea in 1979, and the powers that be at the time said, you know, I think it's a good idea. So we formed the company the holding company, that is, in 1979. At the time it was called National Sugar Rums, right? Okay. It was later changed and registered as National Rums of Jamaica in 1980. But so I was called to manage the 8 sugar entities as group operations manager. But mindful that the sugar was really, really strong, but we're doing all we could to ensure that, and we did meet our quotas. Mm-hmm. So for the next 10 years, from 1975 to 1976 to 1985, National Sugar Company operated, met all our export quotas, We had only shut down one sugar factory during that time.
Okay.
But then the major restructuring came in 1985.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, you had proposed National Rums of Jamaica, but you went off to university somewhere?
Oh, yes. Okay. In 1980, right. In 1980, I was have gone to MIT. I was selected a Sloan Fellow, Alfred P. Sloan Fellow. And but that's the year they asked me to come and assume the responsibility for the sugar factories. So I asked them if they could postpone it for a year. So that's MIT, so that I could at least, put in place my thoughts at National Sugar before I left. And it was agreed. And so I went to MIT in 1981. But I had already laid the base of the National Sugar Plan in 1980 before I left. Um, I did a joint thesis at MIT, of course, which also dealt with National Sugar Company of Jamaica developing a strategic plan to rescue the industry. Um, so I came back with that, and that was, what I thought, was the basis of continuing with the plan. So they put together a plan for the sugar factories at that point in time, and but the government said they couldn't afford um, the resources that were required to effect that plan. So they invited Data Live to come back to manage the three large sugar factories and try and do away with the others, divest the others, or whatever.
Right.
Unfortunately, Data Live came back in 1985 to manage the three factories from one of the most unburdened lot. And those are the big three.
Okay. So when did National Rums of Jamaica sort of really come together as an operating entity?
That's when it came together. It came together at that time of major restructuring in 1985.
Okay.
The time was right, and I said, fine, let us state the line to go and manage these, but it doesn't include rum. So by that time, now we had hived off the rum, we had transferred the assets. At the same time that we were transferring the assets of the three sugar factories to a new holding company, we transferred the assets from the existing sugar companies to the holding company for rum,
Okay.
for National Rums.
Okay.
So that is when National Rum became operational, and that is when I made the transition from sugar to rum.
Okay. So who were the original entity or factories involved with the National Rums of Jamaica?
There were three distilleries and a vinegar plant. We had first started on the North Coast. There was Long Pond Sugar Company, which was owned by Seagram. And so Long Pond was taken over, but as part of the compensation to Seagram for getting their sugar factory, they were given 49% of the shares in the Monimus Distillery,
Right.
which was then called Clarendon Distillers Limited.
Right. So that's an interesting point. Is like you told me about this, and it was like it connected the dots of that Seagram's owned Long Pond, or the Seagram's owned Long Pond, but it was this sort of formation of National Rums in Jamaica that sort of in the compensation no longer having Long Pond, they instead got a percentage share of what we now know as the Clarendon Distillery.
Yes, correct. So their investment then became into Clarendon Distillers, not National Rums.
Right.
It became Clarendon Distillers.
Right.
So they got 49% shares in Clarendon Distillers for surrendering the Long Pond Sugar Factory and the Long Pond Distillery.
Right.
So the Long Pond Distillers, 100% National Rum transferred to National Rums. In case of the Clarendon Distillers, it was also transferred to National Rums, but it was 51% government and 49% Seagram.
Okay. And then
Innswood was the other one.
Right. Which was the other one?
Innswood Estate.
Oh, Innswood.
Innswood Distillery, right.
And they were still operating at the time, for sure.
Yes. So that is 100% of Innswood. But there was 51, 49% at Innswood as well, Innswood Distillery.
Right.
Innswood Sugar Estate, beg your pardon, Innswood Sugar Estate.
Yeah.
But
And it was the Innswood Vinegar Company, wasn't it?
Correct. And most importantly, Matt, and you should know this because I've said it. It was a very popular idea with the entire industry that we should have gone off and set up national rums as a separate, making the rum industry separate and apart from the sugar industry. The cane farmers didn't like it, and they were a strong lobby. Some workers wouldn't have liked it initially, because it was departure from the old sugar, cane types of management, and the government themselves, who came under some amount of pressure from the IMF, not to hold property on companies.
Right.
They came under pressure as well. And they said, look, well, we have to divest National Rums of Jamaica. You've only gone 4 or 5 years, you have done a lot in 4 or 5 years, but it's now on the divestment block.
Right.
And so that created, that was a challenge, I can assure you.
Right.
That was a major challenge.
Yes. So let's jump over to the WIRSPA side of things. Tell us about becoming the WIRSPA representative for Jamaica in the 1980s.
Well, the simple answer to that is that I was elected by the directors of the Jamaica Rum and Spirits Trade Association to be Jamaica's representative on the WIRSPA board. I had previously been attending, occasionally as an observer.
Right.
But I guess my colleagues in their own thinking, they probably thought that, well, I had been in the industry for a while. I had been managing director of National Sugar Company. I had been managing director of the Jamaica Sugar Manufacturing Corporation. I was now managing director of National Rums of Jamaica, executive chairman of the 3 subsidiaries. I was, later on, I was also the CEO of the Sugar Industry Authority for 4 years, from 1996 to 1999. All those things were happening simultaneously.
Right.
And so they said, well, I suppose another one would not too much.
Yeah. So
I joined.
Yeah. Okay. So at that point in time, the Jamaican rum industry was effectively National Rums of Jamaica and Appleton. Was that sort of the
yes, and Hamden.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they were a fairly small producer at that.
Yes. As a matter of fact, when I started out with National Rums, in terms of production, we did 50%. We did 50% of the bulk production of rum in Jamaica at that time.
Right.
David did 45%, and Hamlin did the other 10%,
right.
or 5%, I think it was.
Right.
Of course, David were always branded, so that was where their trust was. They weren't so much in the bulk, business. So.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. There's sort of a parallel or a repeat of what happened with the forming National Rums of Jamaica and privatization and things like that. It sort of happened a few years later in the mid 2000s when essentially the government had by that point had taken over control of Hampton and then resold it. So you sort of this pattern of like the government coming into the industry and then sort of backing away from it or selling from it sort of is repeated for over a number of years in Jamaica.
Yeah, that is true. And but if you think about it, sugar is a tough business, eh? Mm-hmm. And the markets aren't here. The markets are in Europe, essentially.
Right.
And there's great competition from beef by this time, So unless you get all, and you have the resources, if you have all the resources and that you can support it fully, then it becomes easier. But the real pressure on governments is that you have other pressures, you have other concerns that you have to deal. You have to deal with the whole.
Right.
And so there is not enough money to put in one sector, which cannot necessarily pay for itself. And don't forget, when Tate and Lyle came, they offered social services.
Mhm.
They ran clinics and towns and schools, and and that is what the sugar companies did in those days. It was really um, incredibly great,
Right. Right.
but costly.
Yeah. So I want to jump ahead about another decade or so to around 1995, when the Lomé 4 trade agreement, which is very esoteric to a lot of people. I've spent far more time studying it than I ever thought I would. But essentially, by 1995, the WIRSPA and CARIFORUM had finally negotiated, if I remember correctly, unlimited tariff-free access to the European market. That essentially they could make as much rum and as they wanted to, import it into the EU without being subject to tariffs or quotas. And so they finally had reached this agreement, and then sort of off to the side or independently, the EU, the US, and the European Union signed an agreement that essentially negated these advantages that WIRSPA and CARIFORUM had finally negotiated. Basically, this US-EU agreement sort of blew that away. It sort of like obliterated the usefulness of that, and it basically put Caribbean rum in a very precarious position in its ability to sell into Europe against competition from elsewhere, for example, Asia and elsewhere. You were chairman of WIRSPA at the time. Tell us more about this and sort of how you led the response to this.
Thank you, Mark. Let me just take a moment first and really pay tribute to all the chairmen of WIRSPA. All previous chairmen did yeoman work. They worked hard, and they represented the interests of the Caribbean rum sector exceedingly well. It hasn't been easy. And when the first Lomé won in 1975, we fought very hard to ensure that rum was included on a pretty fair footing. What do I mean by that? Rum in the first Lomé convention, Lomé 1 of 1975, was the only commercial product of agricultural origin, only industrial product of agricultural origin to have been subject to a quota to enter the European Union. And we thought that that was unfair because you are restricting the development of the rum industry, because nobody can develop a brand against uncertainty. A brand is a very expensive and time-consuming exercise. 10, 12 years before you start to get your brand aware. So
And Caribbean rum was primarily bulk at the time. It was not.
Yeah, that is the point. That is the point. So you were relegated to being in the bulk end of the business, and as you know, that's bulk commodity rum. That's commodity item, and so at the time it was anticipated that the preferences that were given to the French territories, the French outside territories, DOMs, they got preferential treatment in France. And what it meant is that we, for a start, we had been locked out initially out of the third largest market in Europe because we couldn't enter it, we couldn't compete there. And so all WIRSPA chairmen took that and fought with that battle going through. It lasted for 20 years that the quotas remained to restrict us from being able to proceed. So we got to that agreement in 1995. 1996, just about when we were, all Caribbean rum producers are now looking about converting to branded business and, putting their house in order to go into the branded business. Came this agreement in November 1996, the first WTO ministerial in Singapore. The margins to boot, that there was this agreement totally unrelated to spirits, but spirits had been traded. White spirits, which included rum, 0 for 0, it was called at the time. Market liberalized overnight. No consultation at all with Caribbean rum producers or ACP rum producers, as we call ourselves.
So basically, you were.
I was chairman at the time.
You were chairman, and
Yes,
I think the fear is that competition from, for example, say the Philippines or Brazil or other countries, where basically could undercut Caribbean rum in terms of.
And all those things would have come in and had a special little. Alcatraz is no different from rum, but they would have had their own avenue in, and they would have been able to undersell.
Right, and again, this would have been bulk rum. People didn't necessarily care much about origin or brand or whatever.
No.
It was sort of like these other countries now could come into the European market with a lower cost and basically decrement or negate the Caribbean's rum ability to compete in those markets.
Right. So we had to fight that. So that was that was our first major battle with the EU. So what we did, we got all our briefs together and we briefed our members and handed them briefs so that they could go back to their territories and discuss with their trade ministers and their governments. And soon all governments got on board, and by early 1997, all CARICOM governments were of one accord and continued to lobby their counterparts in Europe to say that this is unjust, this will do great damage to the Caribbean rum industry, this is not what had been agreed, and we need to find a way, first of all, to suspend this immediate liberalization, premature liberalization. We have to suspend it. And then we need to see how best we can appease the industry and help the industry to speed up the request of market liberalization. So that happened in 1997, and it really was massive. It was a massive effort, and it was all over Europe, it was all over the Caribbean, the ambassador, everybody. But the Caribbean won a hard-fought battle after the governments fell in line with us and helped to the political side of it to get that agreement done. And so in 1997, they agreed that they would extend the phasing in of the market liberalization. Instead of to 2000, it now went to 2003. And so that was the first significant part that was won. But by that time, Matt, we had already lost some trust was already on the line because, these things that happened, although we had agreements and we were promised that we would have been, brought into the loop and we would have been able to make our inputs, we weren't able to do it. So we had now a serious battle to fight to be able to carry through on this new agreement that the governments also had been able to get with the EU to stretch it out until 2003. And it started really, and as you mentioned, but that started under my chairmanship, that we started with talking to the French. So we had, first of all, an accord with the French. Look, let us get together. Because there's no point. It's really a rum industry. You are a part of it, we're a part of it. Let us try and work together. Let us see how best we can put forward a united front. You have your interests, we have our interests. Let us have a meeting of the minds and let us go forward as one industry to all the powers that be. And that happened in meetings that we had in London, Brussels, and Paris in 1997, October 1997. I remember well meeting in the French Prime Minister's office with a whole slew of his advisors, and where we thrashed this thing out. And it was an intriguing, hard but intriguing thing, but we all spoke frankly, we put out different points of view. The French supported us, we supported the French, that they would continue to get some, not indefinitely, but they'd continue to get some benefits out of the deal, and they would support us to make sure that we found a common ground that we could go forward. And so that was done in 1997, but we still had to deliver. We had to ensure that we negotiated a package for the Caribbean rum producers and then to implement it. I could say one quick thing about that too, if I may. We had a convention that every 2 years we rotated the chair among member states. This new agreement with the EU called for real concerted, focused action until it was done. And so we agreed we had to have somebody who could carry that ball, would have the time to do it, and give them the necessary latitude and authority to do it. And so Patrick Mayers was right there, and we were happy to ask Patrick to step into the breach.
Yeah, Patrick Mayer being your equivalent at the West Indies Rum Distillery on Barbados.
Yes, but by this time Patrick was about leaving WIRD, and so he had a little more time. Yes, he was at WIRD, right. So he had a little more time and the passion and the knowledge and everything. So Patrick was the right person that we entrusted to do that, and so he did for the next 10 years.
Right. So tell us about the eventual financial package, what the EU supplied, and the Rum Sector Program that came out of us. Tell us a little about that.
Well, what happened there is that in going forward, with Patrick now as chairman, the board set up a regular 3-man committee to negotiate and deliver this package. Chairman Patrick, Isu Prasad, who is a giant in his own right, and myself, we were the 3-man committee that did all the negotiations and brought to bear the acceptable package, which then had to be implemented.
And that being the super show of Dimmer Distillers.
That is correct. But it really was a pretty arduous task, and but Patrick was unflinching, and and we're all there in support, and we went all over Europe and Americas and everywhere, and we got the job done.
Okay. So
then having gotten the job done, it was a signal honor for the EU to appointed WIRSPA to implement the project. Now that was incredible, and this is where Vaughan Reddick and his team did a fantastic job. But that's another story for another time too. But the professionalism and the completeness with which they completed that program was awesome.
Right.
We commend them too.
Right.
And, by that time now we also had another chairman. So this band was 3 chairmen, and it was Frank Ward. After Frank Ward became chairman in 2007, I think it was, to the completion. Right. So the activities completed activities were completed on the 2010, I think it was.
Right.
Yeah.
So
all project activities were complete by that time, and then there was the audit. Don't forget the audit. The EU audits everything, and the audit had to be done. And I think the final audit sign off was in 2010. But salute to Vaughan and his team. It was a wonderful job.
You're right. So as I remember correctly, it was the EU agreed to fund 70 million euros, and that was for what was called the Caribbean Rum Sector Programme. What was sort of the general outline of how that money was to be spent?
Okay, they had guidelines. What is important to the EU was that it was a transitional program, and it's going to help us to convert from bulk commodity rum to value-added branded rum. In essence, that is what the program was all about. Because remember, they were trying to prematurely liberalize the market, but we were not ready. So the money was intended to see us through that process. And but there were a number of other areas that had been included, environmental concerns, which was very high on the agenda for in Europe especially, training, capacity building, and out of that, I can assure you that National Rums was very anxious to be a part of that program.
Yeah.
Because our equipment needed to have been upgraded, like most others, and so we did very well out of it as well,
Yeah, and just for those who aren't completely familiar with what the Rum Sector Program did, the idea was that it was a pool of money that producers like National Rums of Jamaica or Demerara Distillers or Appleton, basically anybody within the WIRSPA or the WIRSPA umbrella could basically propose a project. We'd like to build a new aging warehouse, or we'd like to increase our environmental processing capacity, or add a new still. But they would basically propose a project and then come to WIRSPA, get it approved, and then WIRSPA would fund some aspect, typically around 50%. But what you'll see if you look back in the Caribbean history from around 2003 to 2010, you'll actually see, for example, that National Rums of Jamaica built their new distillery, the new column still distillery. You'll see lots of aging warehouses constructed. There was a substantial increase in the capacity and the environmental awareness of Caribbean rum in that period, and it was essentially in large part funded by this rum sector program. And another aspect of it, to touch on what you were talking about earlier, was moving to branded rum. That's actually where the authentic Caribbean rum mark came from. That was part of that brand building initiative. So that's sort of like in a nutshell what that was. Do you have anything else you want to add to what I've said there?
No, Matthew, you have covered it pretty well. It was a matching funds grant. So it wasn't that the EU gave us money to go and do what we like. We had to match the funds ourselves.
Right.
And so that was important. As a matter of fact, it was particularly important for a company like National Rums, which at that point was basically government owned. We had 49% of Seagram investment in Clarendon Distillers. But it was government, and if it's government, would have to match the funds that were required to access that program.
Right.
And but I'll come back to that in a moment. Because
yeah, that was you touched on that. You said, so with as this sort of transition was occurring, and you saw that the markets liberalizing and so forth, you saw sort of an existential threat to National Rums of Jamaica and is going forward as it currently was structured. How did you respond to that?
Yes, well, it was clear that National Rums could not continue as a bulk only manufacturer. That was commodity rum, and we had to find the value added and to be able to compete. And indeed, and in fact, we were at the time producing almost 50%. We had shrunk by about 5% after the hop with the divestment bid. But we were still at 45% of Jamaica's rum production was being sold as bulk. And so we had to ensure that we could convert a lot of that. But we had to do it by ensuring that our distilleries could operate to world standards. And that is one of the things that that we set out to do, to get into the wider market, to be able to and we're aging rums, of course, by that time. But we had to blend and put a branded product on the market, and we had to upgrade our equipment. We had to have modern facilities, and so that is what we were about at that point in time. So we developed a plan. We developed a plan and put forward to WIRSPA to be considered for funding under this matching funds program. And we did that, and thank heavens we did it early, and we got approved early. But therein lay a big problem. How are we going to fund it? How are we going to find our 50%? Government couldn't do it because they had, little money, and it would be a good idea to privatize it at any rate on a basis like this. So it was a hard time to convince government that allow us to go out and get partners who are compatible and are obviously a part of the business and dedicated to the business. And the government said, okay, then see what you can do if you can, and come back to us before you do anything, and we'll let you know what we will do. And so it was that we got both the existing shareholder in Clarendon, which was then Seagram. So we got Seagram, stroke Diageo, because about the same time Diageo was getting into the picture. So it was, by that time it was Diageo. And our good friends, Isu, who was a real, real good friend, and Isu fell in line and brought along West Israel Distillery.
Right.
And so we worked in a program, worked in a plan, and we presented it to the government, which meant that National Rums would now be owned one-third, one-third, one-third by Demerara, by West Israel Distillery, and by the government. The government did not put any money in, but they had to give up some shares.
Right.
And Diageo had to put some money in, but their shares shrunk from 49% to 27%. And so that is what happened.
Right. So essentially,
but it was a big challenge. I can tell you, it was a challenge.
oh yeah. So it's essentially what you were able to do was convince the government to let you take National Rums of Jamaica private again.
Indeed.
Yes. Okay.
Indeed. And not under the normal divestment program where you put an ad in the newspaper and all of the stuff you can apply, and then you find people who are not compatible and you don't know whose hands it will get into. That wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And so I was able to convince them also of that.
Yeah. So when was that a problem? When was sort of the actual transition to private hands, if you will, for now?
That was in 2006.
2006. Okay.
Yes.
And so that in theory at least assisted with being able to spend money to get WIRSPA funding to build, for example, what became the new column section of Clarendon, for example.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Yes. Okay. So fast forward to a few more decades. When did you retire from the Jamaican rum industry, rum and sugar industry? When did you retire?
Yes, I retired in stages.
Okay.
In 1986, I retired with the first massive restructuring of National Sugar. I retired from factory management at that time, where we had the 8 sugar factories. So 3 had gone over to Fatal Isle and so on. And National Sugar Company at that point, we had about 2 or 3 factories left. We divested. We didn't divest them at the time, but we had separate management taking care of them. So I basically stepped back from the active management of the sugar factories at that point in time and started concentrating more on the rum side. Even though I still had the position of managing director of National Sugar Company because there were assets, including the rum and a few other of the factories. You know, there was Dublin Field and there was Long Pond and so on. So I retired from that. In 2015, I retired fully from all sugar responsibilities. I should let you know, though, that in 1996 to 1999, they also asked me to be the CEO at the Sugar Industry Authority. I'd mentioned that before.
Mhm.
So I also was that, but that was only for 4 years, from 96 to 99. But it was 4 hard years because that sugar thing was very tough. And then I retired from National Rums of Jamaica on the 30th of, I went on pre-retirement leave on the 30th of September 2016. I went on pre-retirement leave, 3 months pre-retirement leave, which became effective on the 31st of December 2016. But I continued to chair the 3 industry boards, which was the Spirits Pool Association, the Chemical Molasses Company Jamaica Limited, and the Jamaica Rum and Spirits Trade Association. So I chaired those for another 2 years until the 31st of July 2019, when I finally retired
Right.
from all
Yeah.
responsibilities.
Yeah. And I'm very happy that I caught you. I think it's possibly your last or second to last WIRSPA meetings when I first met you was at the in St. Lucia. You were there as the Rum Pool Association head.
Yes.
Okay. So what do you consider?
And I came off the WIRSPA board at the same time.
Right. Okay. So what do you consider your top 1 or 2 contributions to Jamaica's rum industry? What are you most proud of?
Ooh, I'm glad you didn't mention sugar. It has to be that the first and foremost, that I was able to rescue the rum industry from a failing sugar industry. That was different. That was significant. And today, of the 6 distilleries that we have operating, only 1 is aligned to a sugar factory. The other 5 are operated independently.
Mhm.
And that was unheard of previously. But we only have 2 sugar factories operating in Jamaica now as well. It's Worthy Park, and they have a distillery.
Right.
And it is Frome in Westmoreland, now operated by the Chinese.
Mhm.
All the other sugar factories are gone.
Right.
And so that was a pretty significant achievement. I'm also happy that we were able to rescue it. And secondly, to ensure that the untidy divestment did not proceed back in about 1990, when Inwood vinegar was actually divested. But we almost lost the 45% or the 50% of the industry that National Rums had at the time, because Diageo were about Seagram were about to leave.
Mm.
They could not stomach the uncertainty. Markets were being lost rapidly, and something had to be done. So that was a big challenge for me. I had to do 3 things there. I had to convince the government first and foremost to withdraw National Rums of Jamaica from the divestment process. That was the first thing I had to do. Secondly, I had to convince Seagram that was done and that they now need to put some more capital into the business to ensure that their interest in Clarendon Distillers was brought up to speed. And thirdly, I had to find a way to support Longpond, which was previously a Seagram company and would have been losing a lot of Seagram's orders. I had to convince Diageo that please help us to see us over this period by continuing to buy some from Longpond whilst we continue building our own markets and brands and stuff. And we had to look for some long-term arrangements. That was massive. That was also massive. That rivaled, if the truth be told, what happened in the EU. But we managed to do it, and we managed to get government to withdraw national rums. We managed to get Diageo, Seagram, Diageo, it was Seagram at the time, Seagram on board. We managed to get a 10-year supply contract with Seagram, guaranteed contract. And we managed to also get them to support Longpond in interim whilst we sought other markets. And we did one other thing. We had to rationalize our distillation capacity. So we closed India in 1990, and that was in January, end of January 1996. End of December 1996, 30th December 1996.
Right.
So those two, and of course the third one was to be able to pull together the deal to implement the EU program.
The Rum Sector Programme.
Yes, and to have at the end of it a distillery which sprung up as our oasis in the desert at Monomusk, without fuss or fanfare. It sprung up, everybody was happy with it, everybody signed off on it, and so that was the other part of what made the most proud. But I would say, and if you'll allow me, I would say that I would have to be in the right place at the right time. All this was done, first through God's goodness. And so I would say thank the Lord above and his family support. And of course, I was blessed with a wonderful team. Every step of the way, I had a wonderful team. And I really owe a great debt of gratitude to that team as well. And for the support they gave, and they were with me through thick and thin, through tears and laughter and high times. It was really, really, really wonderful. And at the end of it, to have products like we have behind us here now, created at the hands of our master blender, Derek Dunn. Tremendous master blender. And I pay tribute to him as well. Really, really fantastic. And so I give thanks for all my friends and supporters all who throughout the world, and yourself and others that I've met recently, later. You're all, have all been wonderful.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Jamaican rum industry was in more precarious straits than a lot of people realized, even 20, 30 years ago. And the fact that there were people like you who helped shepherd it through to what it is today and what it can continue to grow, as your contributions have been invaluable to that. So as a Jamaican rum lover myself, I'm very thankful for your part in all of that.
Thank you, Bob.
So one last question before we go. What are you doing today since you're retired? What have you been up to?
Well, basically, I'm obedient to COVID-19.
Yes.
I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to do, but in between that, obviously, I have been reflecting and doing a few jottings and a few thinking, about doing my memoirs, and some of which I have sort of shared with you today, and contemplating whether or not I should commit all these thoughts and things that I have in my mind at this time whether I should commit it to writing in the
You
form of
I absolutely think you should.
in the form of a publication. You know, should I publish a book? Should I just leave it as my memoirs, or you know? So I'm contemplating these issues, but generally just relaxing. Um, so that's where I'm at, and as I said, I just shared some of my memoirs and thoughts with you. And
Right.
in any case, the sugar cane, what a catalyst of global change.
Yes, yes,
What do you think?
yeah, for sure. So I lied. There's one more last question from Kamal. Kamal Samaru, who's CEO of Demerara Distillers, current WIRSPA chairman. He says, could Evan share his views as to why WIRSPA continues to be a strong trade organization after 50 years, while most other regional trade organizations have not survived?
Well, I must thank Kamal for that question, and I know that Kamal knows the answer very well, but it is really a very deep commitment and bonding of us Caribbean rum producers seeking not only to ensure the growth of our own business, but to ensure that we all move together as a community. This is the place where rum was born. We have to protect that legacy. And I think that each territory is in fact committed to protecting the legacy. And that alone makes sure that we will continue the way we are, going forward from strength to strength. The voice of the Caribbean, the voice of the Caribbean rum industry. And I think we'll continue to do so. And with leadership like Kamal going forward, because he has taken the torch and he's continuing to run with it in such a fantastic way.
Thank you for that. And with that, we're going to wrap up here. Evan, I again want to thank you for all of your time in doing this and all of your conversations with me. I've learned a fantastic amount just from speaking with you, not only from what my professional work, but just also my own curiosity. So it truly is a joy to speak one-on-one with you on these topics and to help share what you have to know and what you've done with the rum community as a whole. So I'm very, very appreciative of everything you've done. So.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt. And I need to say thanks to my friends here in the boardroom of National Rums. I'm at home here in the boardroom of National Rums, and I want to thank Martin Hill and our group for having me here, and that we can all have this conversation today. And last week was a bit of a disappointment. I hope it has been a disappointment this time.
It has been. Will, you want to take us out?
Yeah, thank you both so much for taking the time again to come back and give this another try today. I know before we went live, Matt, you were kind of noting how much recent rum history there is that's out there that isn't necessarily recorded, for posterity. So I think it's great that with this series, you're helping to get some of this amazing history out there and shared with people from people like Evan. So thank you to both of you today for making this happen. And I believe in a few weeks we'll be back with another entry in this series. I think we're still finalizing some of the details there, but anything you can sort of tease about that, Matt?
It will be somebody that Evan mentioned today.
Okay. I like it. So if you're listening, you can go back and look for clues maybe in the recording. But fantastic. Thank you again, everyone in attendance. I know we saw people from all throughout the Caribbean who have made their own contributions to the rum industry. So always really exciting to see that. But thanks to you both. And we'll be back again soon. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.